Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen Center for Thought and Culture. I'm David DeSerto, Interim Executive Director here at the Sheen Center. And on behalf of the Sheen Center, we're delighted that you've chosen to share this evening with us as we launch our new series, Virtue in America. We'd be even more delighted if you choose to spend many more evenings with us this fall. And you can find out about all our events in theater, music, film, and talk at our website. Visit sheencenter.org. We'd like to extend our sincerest gratitude to the National Review Institute for partnering with us on this new initiative, as well as several other events, including an author night this Friday with Tim Carney, who will talk about his new book, Alienated America. Speaking of books, in his book, Book of Virtues, William Bennett writes, "Today we speak of values and how important it is to have them as if they were beads on a string or marbles in a pouch. But virtues are not something to possess, but a central part of human nature, not as something to have, but something to be, the most important thing to be." The purpose of this new series is to reclaim that ground, the idea of what it means to live virtue. And we're kicking things off with the theological virtue of hope, that winged thing that perches on the soul, according to Emily Dickinson. A virtue so needed in our world today that seems so bereft of hope. But as G.K. Chesterton once remarked, hope means hoping when things are hopeless, or it is no virtue at all. Now, as a Yankee fan this week, I am all about hope. My apologies to any visitors from Minnesota, and I know some of our speakers are from D.C., so good luck to the Nationals as well. Serving as our host for this new series is Kathryn Jean Lopez. Kathryn is a senior fellow at the National Review Institute, where she directs the Center for Religion, Culture, and Civil Society. She is also editor-at-large of National Review magazine and a nationally syndicated columnist who writes about faith and culture for a number of religious and secular publications. She's the author of a new book, A Year with the Mystics, Visionary Wisdom for Daily Living. And most important, Kathryn is a very dear friend and a friend of the Sheen Center. So it is my great privilege to welcome to the stage, Kathryn.
Wow, there's a very bright light. Thank you so much for coming, all of you who I cannot actually see. Thank you, seriously, for coming. I know there are a lot of demands on your time and strains on your time, and it's a beautiful night, spring-like night here in the fall in New York, so thanks for being indoors. Thank you for prioritizing virtue by virtue of being here tonight, because I truly believe that's what we're doing here. We're choosing to be people of hope. Over the weekend, I was praying about this event and this series that we're starting here, the Virtue in America series that we're launching tonight. And I encountered this from St. Paul, writing to Timothy. "I repeat the directions I gave you when I was on my way to Macedonia. Stay on in Ephesus in order to warn certain people there against teaching false doctrines and busying themselves with interminable myths and genealogies which promote idle speculations rather than that training in faith which God requires. What we are aiming at in this warning is the love that springs from a pure heart, a good conscience, and sincere faith. Some people have neglected these and instead have turned to meaningless talk, wanting to be teachers of the law but actually not understanding the words they are using, much less the matters they discuss with such assurance." Wow, does that sound familiar? That definitely resonated. We live in a world of all kinds of meaningless talk. We don't know the meaning of words often that we're hearing being used everywhere. This series aims to be a solution to that problem. We need to talk about and encourage and celebrate virtue. We need to thank people like the three here with me, who will be on stage in a moment, who are seeking to live the virtuous life. And in the public square, they help with our hope. They are light and in the darkness. So maybe this is a metaphor that I'm seeing this bright light in the darkness. I got to know, as no small example, I got to know J.J. Hanson, Kristen Hanson's late husband, because he was in the midst of a battle with brain cancer. He was also fighting assisted suicide in New York State, which his wife continues to do now that he's left this world. We're starting this virtue series with hope because it's so needed today. Just look around, so much tempts despair and people overwhelmed. A friend of mine, actually a mutual friend of a couple of ours, Mark Rogers, I thought named it really well in last year or two. He said, we're like a nation of people with post-traumatic stress syndrome, and the trauma just keeps increasing every time you turn on the news. The hope for the Sheen Center here, if this is your first time here, welcome, is about the church engaging with ideas and culture with the values that set men's hearts free at the heart of yes. Yes, the heart of it is the church, but it's also about the values that we inherit from our Jewish friends and neighbors and are shared by all people of goodwill. So this place exists to engage with all of that and to be a welcoming place where we can have discussions like this. This team up with the National Review Institute is only natural given William F. Buckley Jr., the founder of National Review and the National Review Institute, was a Catholic who was not afraid of having conversations with people from all different points of view about fundamentals. So much so that actually his best piece on virtue may have been a piece he wrote about virtue for Playboy magazine. Pope Francis always talks about going to the peripheries. Bill Buckley did that. He had Hugh Hefner on his PBS show Firing Line, and he didn't hold back. He told Hugh Hefner from the offset that he thought that the Playboy philosophy was destructive to the family and to culture, to our country. But a relationship started, right? That led Hefner to invite him to write for Playboy, and Bill used the opportunity for good. And here on Bleecker Street, in the midst of the bustle of the city and some darkness and misery just next door, we seek to do the same. When Pope Benedict visited the United States in 2018, the Archdiocese of Washington took out ads on the metro proclaiming, it was on the back of the buses, and there were ads in the metro stations. The quote was, "One who has hope lives differently." The words came from his encyclical on hope, Spe Salve. The sentence is, "The one who has hope lives differently. The one who hopes has been granted the gift of a new life." I kind of consider that the most important fact about this virtue, and the bottom line about it too. If you have hope, your life looks different, and people want to know what the source of your hope is. Today actually happens to be the anniversary of John Paul II's 1995 visit here to New York. I was at the Mass in Central Park 24 years ago this morning. George Weigel wrote two big books, Peter's colleague, George Weigel, two big volumes on JP2, and just a year or so ago, he published a third. It's called Lessons in Hope. By getting to know John Paul and the history around his life, George saw hope overflowing. It's hard to know John Paul II's life without being drawn into a trust about God's providence, confidence that God knows what he's doing, the same kind that led Poles to break out into "We Want God" for 12 minutes during what Weigel calls the 9 days that changed the history of the 20th century, when John Paul returned home for the first time as Pope in 1979. I'm delighted to be here tonight with these wonderful people and you wonderful people. The speakers we have here tonight made sacrifices to be here, and I am so grateful. I'm sure you are too, and will be increasingly when you hear from them. These three are people who live differently. I'm not going to go into their biographies because you have them in your programs. We have a bipartisan problem today. Looking for politics, from politics, things that politics can't provide. And I think one of the most important things to know about these two men, Pete Wehner and Michael Ware, is that they work in politics and policy and media, but they have hope. They do not let these necessary things of this world consume them. They view politics from a different lens, a lens of hope, because they see beyond it. They trust beyond it. They live beyond it, this politics. And Kristen, she and her family are what hope looks like, as you'll see tonight. Hope is not Pollyannish optimism. It involves real, rigorous, and tender love in the mess of life. Love will probably be the next installment in this Virtue in America series that we're beginning tonight, but hope is a kind of love story, and Chris and J.J. Hanson's love is a living hope, even as J.J. has left the world, as you'll see tonight. We're going to begin now with, first I want to invite Peter and Michael and Kristen to have seats. And well, actually, that's a bad idea. You want to watch the videos too. Although Kristen has seen them many times. So we'll watch the videos and then we'll take the stage. Thank you.
My family has had a motto someone would complain about. I can't go out to school today because I'm sick. And my dad's response would be, you can't hurt steel. I was very active growing up, did a lot of sports, played football. My family has a long line of military service, specifically the Marine Corps. While I was in the Marine Corps, I got married to my wife, Chris.
Life couldn't have been more perfect. We had just had James. He was 1 year old. We had moved to Florida. JJ had a job that he absolutely loved.
We were living what people would consider as the American dream. May of 2014, I started to feel what felt like a very deep anxiety attack. And I knew something was wrong with me because it just kept getting worse. And at that point, my ability to speak began to go away.
My phone rang, and I saw it was JJ's number on my caller ID. And I answered it, and a woman's voice was on the phone. She was a paramedic. She was with JJ. He had had a grand mal seizure.
They started doing tests. They weren't going to do an MRI initially. However, my wife, Chris, pushed them very heavily to do an MRI.
The neurologist came back in and looked at us, and I'll never forget the look on his face when he told us, you have 2 lesions in your left temporal lobe.
Grade 4 glioblastoma multiforme, which is one of the, if not the deadliest form of brain cancer that exists. The neurosurgeon who conducted the biopsy said that the cancer was inoperable. You have 4 months to live. In a best case scenario, you may get a year.
And that was it. He walked away.
When a week before that, you were running, you were having fun, you were hanging out with your kid and your wife, you were working, and everything seemed fine. And all of a sudden, a man comes in and says, you're gonna die. You don't just accept it because someone said it. We had one doctor that told us that, go home, enjoy the time you have left. And yet another doctor said, we got this, no problem, we'll get it out.
He had the surgery at Memorial Sloan Kettering, and he had an amazing neurosurgeon. They monitored to see if he was having seizures that we just couldn't see. Over the next 24 hours, he had 9 more seizures. So by the time that was done, he couldn't talk at all.
Would this be easier if I just gave up? If I just said, this is too much of a burden on my family, the pain is difficult, I don't want to deal with this. What if I just said, I had enough and ended it? I would be okay the next day because I would be gone. I wouldn't feel the pain, I wouldn't feel the emotion. They do. My wife would feel it for the rest of her life. My son would not have one more day to spend with me.
No matter how bad those days were, we had to fight for James. James makes us stronger.
I still have cancer today. I still have active cancer cells. I'm still on chemo. And I have people say all the time, you don't look like it. You don't look like you have active cancer. It's because every single part of my day I spend towards improving my ability to live. I followed the Brittany Maynard case. To a certain extent, I could identify with what she was dealing with. Same disease, roughly the same age, both had families, but I don't agree with what she chose to do. You can't unmake that choice. Once you do it, it's done. Unless a cure is found, the disease will come back. When and how, I don't know. My hope and my fight is to keep it at bay for as long as possible.
I'd say my biggest fear with assisted suicide is that a patient will go to a doctor who already views them as a terminal patient and sees little hope for anything else, any other treatment options, any other outcomes other than death.
Chris has saved my life. And she did that while being a mother, while paying the bills. I didn't have to ask for it. I didn't have to need it. She did it because she loved me. And she's my best friend. And I couldn't imagine being with anybody else besides her.
You are more my hero now than I ever thought possible. And I love you, and you're my best friend.
Every single day is a gift. And you can't let that go.
He looks at the world and he wants to make it a better place. He said, Chris, we got to share this to help other people. They need to know that it's okay for this to happen. And don't be afraid. I started tearing up and I said, only you, James Joseph Hanson, are worried about other people in this moment. He only has about 4 weeks left to live.
Yeah.
And that was a week ago. The end of September, he got depressed and there was no hope at this point.
I was done. Done. But now, we're gonna keep going.
It's been hard to advocate for JJ. I'm his healthcare proxy. He chose me because I think he knew that I would think, what would JJ want? And I would ultimately fight for him, but I would also let him go. All we can do is today, right?
Yeah.
And we can make today the best we possibly can. We had 3.5 years now when they first only gave you 4 months.
We are in love with each other. No worries.
Always and forever. Try to hold on to hope. For yourself, for those around you, for people you don't even know. And it could be changing their life and you don't even know. You can't think about assisted suicide in one situation. You have to step back and think about who it could hurt because it puts so many people at risk. And that is the danger with assisted suicide. You'll never know. If you make that choice, if you do that, you might have lived like JJ. He had 3.5 good years, so many beautiful moments we've shared as a family. James has gotten to know his daddy. He knows who his daddy is now. We have Lucas. The joys that we have been able to experience in these 3.5 years are too many to count. And when I stop for a moment to think of if we had listened, if we had given up hope, we would have missed out on so much. Lucas requires so much care and love right now. He's dependent on me for everything. And I do it with joy. I take care of him with joy. And why is that so different at the end of life? Every moment we can share together is a gift.
I sometimes think if the question is why hope, the answer is Lucas. This family is so beautiful, and I consider JJ our 4th panelist, and so he just said his piece. Kristen, thank you so much for being here, and would you please share with us some of your thoughts about hope? Thank you.
Thank you all for being here tonight, and Kathryn, thank you for inviting me. On the surface, our family story is undeniably tragic, but our journey is also one of hope that's been filled with so many miracles, big and small, that it's allowed us to smile amidst the suffering and the sorrow. When I look back, I'm filled with overwhelming gratitude for all that happened in the 3.5 years following JJ's diagnosis. There are so many moments where it's clear that if something had gone differently, we wouldn't have had that time together, and that would have been even more tragic. May 13th, 2014 was a day that had started like any other and changed our lives in an instant. By the time I arrived at the ER, the nurse told me that they were getting ready to discharge JJ. All the tests that they had run were normal. I wanted desperately to believe what she was saying, but something in my heart told me that they were missing something. I asked, couldn't it be that the CAT scan missed something? And I insisted that they do an MRI before we went home. They ended up doing one that evening, and the next morning the neurologist came in to evaluate JJ. He asked him some questions, he checked his reflexes, and then he said, well, 50% of people have a seizure and they never have one again. So we're going to send JJ home, and let's just hope that he doesn't have another one. And again, I was filled with hope, and I wanted to believe what he was saying, but something said to ask about the MRI. He hadn't realized that they did one, so he left the room to check the results. And when he came back in, that's when we found out that JJ had the 2 lesions on his left temporal lobe of his brain. I often wonder what would have happened if I hadn't asked about the MRI, if I hadn't persisted and insisted that they did one. I'll never know for sure, but there was one thing that was certain in that moment. I knew that I had to fight for JJ. I had to desperately hold on to hope for him and become his fearless advocate. If JJ's cancer had gone undetected and they sent him home, it would have grown. He had glioblastoma multiforme, the most aggressive form of cancer that there is, and it can double in size every 2 weeks. And at that point, the neurosurgeon already thought it was inoperable because it was located directly on his speech center, and the risk of him losing all ability to speak and understand language was so high that he felt it was unsafe to do surgery. I was told that JJ likely only had 4 months to live. If we were lucky, maybe we could get a year. If it had been a less aggressive cancer, maybe we could have gotten 3 years. In that moment, time stood still. I couldn't breathe. Everything went silent except for the pounding of my heart and the sound of my own voice in my head crying out, why? Why us? Why JJ? Why 4 months? Why not 3 years? In that moment, 3 years felt like an eternity, and I would have given anything for 3 years. Although everything that the doctors were telling us sent a message of hopelessness, I knew that we had to hold on to hope. But the one thing we didn't have was time, and everywhere we called for a second or third opinion said that they said it was going to be 2 weeks at least until they could get JJ in. So we reached out to friends and family to share the news of his diagnosis, and it just so happened that one of our friends was out with another group of friends that evening. One of the men there happened to be the chief of anesthesiology at the Moffitt Cancer Center in Tampa, where we were living. It's one of the leading research hospitals in the Southeast, and he just so happened to be next door neighbors with the chief of neurosurgery at Moffitt. He said, I can call him and see if they can get JJ in sooner. Sure enough, by that evening, we received a phone call and found out that JJ had an appointment the next day with the chief of neurosurgery at Moffitt. I can't tell you how much hope that gave us. The neurosurgeon said that he could do the surgery, but they would have to do it with JJ awake because it was so dangerous they would have to test him as they were removing tumor to see what would be permanently damaged. JJ's dad wanted desperately for JJ to come to New York City to go to Sloan so that he would be closer to home. JJ had worked in New York state politics, so he started calling everyone he knew. He called state legislators, he called the governor's office, he called congressmen. The answer was always the same. We're sorry, but it's going to be at least 2 weeks until you can get an appointment. And the neurosurgeon at Moffitt was clear on one thing. There was no more time. So we made an appointment for the following week at Moffitt to have the surgery, and we decided to fly to New York in the hopes that we would miraculously get an appointment at Sloan. As we were waiting in the Tampa airport about to board the plane, we received a phone call from a family friend. JJ's dad had called his longtime fishing buddy friend and told him the news, to which Vinny, his longtime friend and a very Italian friend, replied, "I've got a guy. I'll call Doc." We didn't know it at the time, but Doc just so happened to be the chief of immunotherapy at Memorial Sloan Kettering. Vinny is a carpenter and had done work for Doc in his home in upstate New York, where we lived in the same town. To our amazement, at the airport, Vinny was calling to tell us that we had an appointment the next morning with the chief of neurosurgery at Sloan. We had 2 back-to-back appointments with 2 neurosurgeons, 2 chiefs of neurosurgery at 2 of the leading research hospitals in the United States. If that wasn't a miracle, we didn't know what was. The neurosurgeon's response at Sloan was that, "We've got this. We do 3 of these a day." He said, "This is our bread and butter." He felt that they had a safe access route to the tumors, and he wanted JJ asleep during the surgery. He said it was much safer than awake surgery. So we scheduled the surgery at Sloan for the next week on May 29th, which just so happened to be our 9-year wedding anniversary. The neurosurgeon removed the 2 tumors and actually found a third while he was doing the surgery, and JJ recovered beautifully in the beginning, until about the second day when his speech and his comprehension started to decline, to the point where when the doctors came in and asked him what his name was, he had no idea what they were asking him. My heart broke as I looked at the doctor's eyes, and I could see that they were giving up on him. I didn't know how to make them hope like I had hope, and they told me that if nothing changed, they were going to send him home the next day because there was nothing else they could do for him in the hospital. But I refused to give up. I knew that they must be missing something. Something in my heart told me to keep pressing. And so I finally got them to agree to do an EEG and monitor for seizures. I desperately was hoping that he was having subclinical seizures that we just couldn't see. And it turned out by that evening, JJ had his first visible seizure. Over the next 24 hours, he had 9 more seizures before they could make them stop. Those were some of the most frightening days of my life. JJ had a difficult recovery, and even with the successful surgery and chemotherapy and radiation, the prognosis was still very grim. 70% of patients with GBM die within the first year, and less than 2% make it to 5 years. But the one thing that patients need more than anything else is hope. And so we did everything we could to give JJ a chance at survival. We enrolled him in a clinical trial, and JJ ended up responding beautifully. He went into remission for 2 years. A few months after JJ's diagnosis, when he was in the middle of treatment, Brittany Maynard's story was starting to make headlines across the country. Some of you may remember Brittany. She was a beautiful young woman, about the same age as JJ, with the exact same cancer, but she famously decided to end her life by moving to Oregon to commit assisted suicide and then to advocate for its legalization in her home state of California. I remember when we first saw her on TV, JJ and I could see so clearly how her story was being glamorized to spread a message of hopelessness. So JJ, not being one to sit on the sidelines, started calling friends and colleagues to see how he could share his story to send a message of hope to patients. Eventually, JJ connected with the Patients' Rights Action Fund, and they came to our home to film that first video. And a few months later, when JJ was off all treatment and in remission, they asked him to be the president of the Patients' Rights Action Fund and lead the national fight against the legalization of assisted suicide. The next year was one of the happiest of our lives. JJ was healthier than we could have ever imagined. He loved his new job, and we could see so clearly how his diagnosis was being used to slow down assisted suicide across the country. It was threatening to sweep the country after Brittany's story made headlines. It was during that time that we allowed ourselves to dream of the possibility of having more children. But in October of 2016, we found out that JJ's cancer was back. We eventually found a new experimental clinical trial for immunotherapy, but when we signed the paperwork for the trial, we found out that we had to agree that we wouldn't get pregnant. They had no idea whether it would cause birth defects, and my heart broke as we signed those documents, but we knew that we had to do it. In early November, right after JJ started the clinical trial, we found out we were pregnant. Miraculously, we had gotten pregnant in the week or two before he started the trial. In July of 2017, we welcomed our little miracle baby into the world. Shortly after Lucas was born, though, we found out that JJ wasn't responding to the treatments anymore, and his health started to decline. So we did everything we could to enjoy the time that we had together with the full knowledge that every single day is a gift. What makes life here on earth so valuable is that it doesn't last forever. What makes life so precious is that it ends. We couldn't save JJ's life, but we can continue to share his story and help save other lives. We can be warriors of hope in an all too often hopeless world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kristen. You inspire me every time I hear you. Thank you. I'd like Michael Ware to take the podium next. Michael, thank you so much for being such a voice of reason and civility and sanity in politics today, and trying to save the Democratic Party from its extremist elements, which is quite the task. So thank you for taking it up. Thank you for being here, Michael.
I don't think I'm going to put that on my business card. I need to stick with a different title. Really appreciate you all. I'm going to talk about mostly ideas, which seems kind of, I'm just going to name it. Seems kind of weird after the presentation we just heard. Thank you for the work you're doing and what you shared. Dallas Willard has this idea, which is not his alone, but which he called the disappearance of moral knowledge. In the American context, Willard suggests that this shift took place after World War II and basically entails gatekeepers of knowledge deciding that only certain kinds of knowledge were permissible and to be accepted in academia primarily, but that sort of filtered out into all of society and sort of general discourse. In his book, Hope in a Time of Abandonment, Jacques Ellul identifies something similar, though he describes it in no less striking terminology than the very absence or silence of God in culture, society, and communal affairs. And after describing the state of affairs, he writes, if it is true that the world in which we live is a world of abandonment, if it is true that God is silent and that we are alone, then, as I shall try to demonstrate later, it is under these circumstances and at this moment that the preaching, the proclamation, the declaration, and the living of hope is urgent. It must be prior and central. He continued, quite simply, the central matter today is not whether to believe or not, but whether to hope or not. I believe this is central. This is the central matter in our time as well. The question we must ask, the question that is present, whether we beckon it or not, is what can I hope for? In 1962, psychologist Herbert Plug published a series of essays based on his experiences working with patients who had attempted to commit suicide or who were incurably ill. What hope could these people possibly have or find? What hope did they lose? Plug discovered that in addition to some of the types of hopes that we speak about kind of flippantly, I hope that parking space opens up. I hope that girl calls me back. There was another kind of hope, fundamental or authentic hope, he called it. Catholic historian remarked that one almost senses the surprise of discovery in Plug's account of this. while the hopes, sort of the trivial hopes are directed towards something worldly, something to be fully attained and realized. Fundamental hope, Plug writes, is not directed toward anything that one could have, but rather has something to do with what one is. There's another finding from Plug's work that is valuable for our discussion today, and it's a finding that the historian noted as well, and that is the troubling idea that real hope, or fundamental hope, only comes once our little hopes are proven to be insufficient or flat out false. It is only when our little hopes are disappointed that we find ourselves situated between the harshness of despair and the daunting, unusual existence of an authentic hope. The quote is now familiar to most of us. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. The sentence was woven into the carpet in the Oval Office in the administration that I worked in. I would look at it whenever I was in the room, and it's now a part of our political dialogue, used to bless a whole range of political solutions. The sentence is often attributed to Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., but King was quoting another clergyman, Theodore Parker. And it was Parker who wrote in the early 19th century that from what he could see, that arc bends toward justice and reminds readers that things refuse to be mismanaged long. Jefferson trembled when he thought of slavery and remembered that God is just. Ere long, all America will tremble. King used a version of the phrase in an article for a Christian newsletter over a century later, but what remained constant was its connection to the initiative and involvement of God. In context, here's what King wrote. Those of us who call the name of Jesus Christ find something at the center of our faith which forever reminds us that God is on the side of truth and justice. Good Friday may occupy the throne for a day, but ultimately it must give way to the triumphant beat of the drums of Easter. Evil may so shape events that Caesar will occupy a palace and Christ a cross, but that same Christ will rise up and split history into AD and BC so that even the life of Caesar must be dated by his name. And then, and only then, could King write, yes, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. The whole idea was only intelligible to King when joined with a confidence in Christ and in God's nature and faithfulness. The arc of the moral universe does not bend toward justice because of a political program or the unassailable motives of humans, but because of a God who wills justice. History, then, is not about human progress, but as one theologian put it, about God breaking into human history to establish his reign and to advance his purposes. It is hope that makes way for us, not the other way around. There is indeed an arc to the moral universe, but it is not a matter of humanity progressing toward justice. Rather, it is the God of justice who is moving toward us. And it's this hope that opens our eyes to the present, this hope that must inform our present. I've been thinking about this just over the last week. We don't have time here to delve into all the details of the case. It's very complicated. But the Amber Geiger case and the killing of Botham Jean was in the press last week, and there was a big debate in some quarters about forgiveness, which I could easily talk about here, and sort of the political inconvenience of forgiveness. Does it sort of release the pressure valve that might be helpful in causing societal change? And that's relevant here. But I want to talk about something else. The judge in the case, after the decision was handed down, she actually approached Amber Geiger, and who was found guilty, and hugged her and gave her a Bible and told her to read John 3:16. This was after, of course, Botham Jean's brother expressed forgiveness during the trial, and there was, again, a huge debate about that. And the judge sort of who was presiding over this trial picked up on that. A secularist group, filed a lawsuit against the judge in the last few days. New York Times reported on this with the headline, "Amber Geiger's judge gave her a Bible and a hug. Did that cross a line?" The New York Times story goes on to discuss that it's not so much the judge's generally compassionate disposition that was unusual, Not even the judge's hug was unheard of. They recounted stories of other judges and sort of the judges expressing compassion from the bench quite often. The real area of concern, certainly for the secularist group that filed the lawsuit, was the Bible, the reference to religion. And many people, including many Christians, receive this news with a kind of openness. They recoil a bit, as if to say, I don't know if she should have done that. I certainly heard a lot of that. But of course, there would be no story if the judge had spouted something from our updated compendium of socially acceptable encouragement, no matter how useless or even counterproductive. Had the judge told Geiger to believe in yourself and you'll make it through this, no eyebrows would have been raised. Had the judge handed Geiger a book from a secular psychologist on dealing with guilt, there would be no issue. We have deemed moral knowledge as unfit for the general welfare, and in the absence of the horizon real hope provides, we have closed in on ourselves. C.S. Lewis understood the temptation to seek ultimate meaning in politics. His essay, Membership, is, I think, most instructive in this regard. In it, he writes, "A sick society must think much about politics as a sick man must think much about his digestion. However, if either comes to regard it as the natural food of the mind, if either forgets that we think of such things only in order to be able to think of something else, then what was undertaken for the sake of health has become itself a new and deadly disease." Our culture and many people in our churches are sick with that new and deadly disease. Politics is causing great spiritual harm in Americans' lives, and a big reason for that is Americans are going to politics to have their spiritual needs met. This is the meaning of rising polarization. It's the cause of our zero-sum mentality. Politics does a poor job of meeting spiritual needs, but if it will get your vote, politicians will attempt to fill the spiritual void nonetheless. Our politics can only cause such spiritual harm because our national life has become so spiritually vacuous. In that same book I mentioned earlier, Jacques Ellul writes, "Man is capable of great things, positive as well as negative. That is obvious. But he cannot fill the void left by the withdrawal of God. In the midst of this silence, no other response than hope is possible. In particular, the ways in which we are trying today to put up a front, like the theology of the death of God, theological research, and the asking of questions, are false appearances out of which man erects the scenery to give the impression that he is still in charge, that he is in no way abandoned, and that it is he who decides the fate of the Word of God. But it is a farce, as is also the substitution of service for faith, the claim of uniqueness for horizontal relationships as opposed to the emptiness of the vertical relationship. The only honest and courageous attitude is to see things as they are and then to respond to God's decision with hope." And so to bring my comments to a close, and hopefully we'll have an opportunity to discuss politics more explicitly as we go on, I believe it is hope that our politics lacks right now. And in the midst of a season of intense political conflict, it can become easy to lose sight of that. It can become easy to get distracted and to be concerned with point scoring and responding to violence and aggression in kind, to leave no quarter. But for all of the strident polarization that has defined our politics and culture, the cynicism and bravado that is on the surface of our politics, what we must come to terms with is that this frantic performance belies a lack of confidence, not an abundance of it. Our politics today is a politics of the disappointed, or what Parker Palmer referred to as a politics of the brokenhearted. It is the same brokenheartedness that Plug, the German psychologist, identified in his study, the brokenheartedness of the failure of little hopes, the inadequacy of our planning. And we are surrounded by broken hearts. This is the source of so much of what we take to be attacks. Stridency is always a veneer. And it is in this period of brokenheartedness, of profound disappointment that is roiling our politics, when hope seems both utterly unthinkable and perhaps more than ever essential. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. I'm willing to bet that this is the first time you've spoken and someone's followed up with a Rush Limbaugh story. when you first got up and said, "Oh gosh, I'm about to talk about ideas," when we just heard this amazing story, I remembered National Review's 50th anniversary celebration. And Bill Buckley was alive at the time, and he was there. But Rush was one of the speakers. Rush Limbaugh was one of the speakers. And there were a number of wounded warriors, Marines, who wanted to meet him. So they're very obviously, like, without limbs and things. And Rush is just completely embarrassed that they think he's some kind of hero, right? Because they're the heroes here. And one of the Marines said, "No, you don't understand, Mr. Limbaugh. We all have our roles, and your witness is as important as Chris's. And thank you too also for sharing what you have about your own life and adoption and your gratitude for your birth mother. And those aren't easy things to talk about in the public square. And you could just talk about ideas, but you don't. And you also witness civility, as does Pete Wehner. And I was reminded during the Amber Geiger closing, all of that drama during the court scene, of something Pope Paul VI wrote, a really stirring homily that shows up in the Office of Readings every year in the prayers of the church. And he says the most important thing for Christians to do is to proclaim Christ. You proclaim Christ with the way you live your life, but you also have to say his name, in the world. And Pete Wehner does that so often. And in the New York Times, if you go through his archive, maybe every couple of columns is explicitly about Christianity or grace, redemption. Thank you for doing that, Pete. And I apologize that your publisher made it so that you have to say the name of your book, The Death of Politics, is really hopeful. It really, really is. But I guess death sells more than life. But we're trying to make a difference here in that. Thank you, Pete.
Thank you, Kathryn, ladies and gentlemen, for coming here, for David, for the Sheen Center National Review Institute for hosting this event. I just want to start out, Kristen, by telling you how moving that tribute was. It's a beautiful tribute, and it was a beautiful love story. So I'm very sorry for your loss and the pain of that loss. But to take a loss of that magnitude and to leverage it into affirming life and hope is an extraordinary testimony and an extraordinary tribute. And I'll say something that I think you know, but I'll say it anyway, which is when you and your two sons see JJ again, which you surely will, in a place where there are no more tears and no more death and no more sorrow, all the angels in heaven will rejoice. So again, thanks for that tribute to hope and to your husband. Just a couple of quick thoughts, and then we'll go into a discussion with all of you, because we're interested in the conversation, the questions. I want to say several things. I want to first say something about the title of this series, which is Virtue in America. So I really am grateful that it is Virtue in America, not Values. It's when you were quoting David from Bill Bennett's The Book of Virtues, I actually worked with Bill for more than a decade. My first job in government was as a speechwriter for Bill when he was Secretary of Education under Ronald Reagan. And that case that he made for reclaiming virtue was I think, the best contribution that he made in his public life. And there's a big difference between virtue and values. Virtues are objective and firm, and they don't change. It's like the primary colors. They're with us forever. And I believe that virtue will make a comeback, because I think in the end, virtue most aligns with human anthropology and the human condition, and that people will discover as they wander from the path that virtues are not just objectively true, but they're really the path to human fulfillment and the good life, and that they embody what's good and right and beautiful in the world, and that when you lose virtue, you lose an awful lot of what it means to be human. But we need to be able to talk about those things, and to make our case, and not to be shy or apologetic about standing up for things like virtues. One of my favorite lines is in a poem by Wordsworth. It's the Prelude, which is a very, very long poem. But one of the lines in it is from Wordsworth is, "What we have loved, others will love, and we will teach them how." And I think that one of the tasks that we have as people who believe in virtue, and for many of us who are of the Christian faith, is to teach others what we love, and why it's something that they may love as well. A couple quick thoughts on hope. First, maybe just very briefly on the theological side, and then on the political side, which Kathryn had asked me to talk about. It's one of the three great theological virtues: faith, hope, and love. And it is it's an orientation. It's a belief in a future good that's difficult but attainable, and it's central, I think, to human life, or it's important for human life, because if you lose hope, you lose an awful lot. Hope, I think about it in two ways. One is hope in this world, and that's important, and that is a belief and a confidence that things can change for the better, and that we have to work for that. And that's why all of us in our different vocations and lives try and do. We try and nudge the world a little bit in the right direction. And it's a notion very central to the Christian faith, which is this notion that we're the incarnation, really, that Jesus came down to earth and cared about it, and cared about redeeming the world, and he was active in our lives. But hope, it sustains us through trials. But it's important, I think, to say that it doesn't remove the trials itself. And we don't know how things in this world will end up. I remember I didn't grow up as a Christian, but when I started my Christian pilgrimage, one of the things that struck me very early on was this notion of the centrality of the cross, and that the Christian story is a story of agony, as well as resurrection and hope. And I never started that journey with the belief that everything was going to turn out fine in our journey in this world. If that's what people are after, then Christianity is not the place to go, it seems to me, because in fact a lot of the epistles are filled with and Jesus' words itself, which is, the world hated me, the world will hate you. There's persecution and hardship, and as I said, there's a cross, but there is also, of course, the resurrection, and that is the great and sustaining thing. And it seems to me that one of the ways to think about this is that we are part of a human drama, and there's a beginning and a middle and an end, and there's an author to our story. We don't know how that story plays out exactly, and when you're in the middle of a very difficult chapter, those things are real, and the pain is real, and it can be searing, and it'd be an affectation to pretend that what causes the pain will automatically be removed. But I think for those of us of the Christian faith, there is this belief that this drama has an author, and that he's in control of our lives and our future, and that this is only part of the story. As C.S. Lewis writes in The Last Battle, that this life here is the title and the cover page, but when this is done, that there are chapters we'll be at the beginning of chapters that never end. And during our journey in this world, we have to have hope, but we have to believe that the important thing is to be faithful. We may not always be successful, but we should be as faithful, and that's ultimately what we will be judged by. And that we can hold lightly to the things of this world as well. I've noticed, particularly in politics, a lot of times people of the Christian faith, they get involved with it, and it seems to me that they hold so tightly to politics. It's almost kind of white knuckles of fear. It's a sense that says that if we fail, then God fails. If we lose this election, if we lose this Supreme Court nomination, that all the things that we love and care for will be gone with the wind, will be washed away. And it seems to me that's really not a Christian attitude that one should approach these things with. In fact, God is sovereign. He doesn't depend on us. We depend on him. And we're not going to thwart his will and his ways. So we have to be faithful, but we have to walk with hope, and we have to walk with a sense that this will work out, and that we can hold lightly to the things of the world, even as we take our jobs and our tasks in this world very seriously. Just a final word on hope as it relates to politics. I think we're at a low moment in American politics. Not the lowest moment ever, but it's a tough time. It's a bad time. There's a lot of acrimony, a lot of hatred, a lot of antipathy, a lot of shouting going on, very little listening. Everybody in this audience can have, I'm sure you have your own stories, which demonstrates what is wrong with politics today. But I'm kind of an incorrigible optimist when it comes to America. So I'd say when you look out at politics and are tempted to give up on it, to become cynical, or to use despairing, I'd say just several things. The first is the importance of keeping historical perspective on these things. This is not the worst moment in American history by a long shot. And politics has been worse than it is now. I mean, if you go back to the election of 1800 between Adams and Jefferson, that was one of the nastiest elections in American history. And if you read what historians say, it almost tore the young republic apart. We barely survived that. There was the Civil War, which literally tore the country apart. 700,000 dead in a country of 29 million. That's the equivalent of about 7 million today. That was a much, much worse time. Late 60s and early 1970s, when you had riots in the streets, riots on campuses, March on the Pentagon, in the early 70s, the killings at Kent State, the riots in Chicago during the Democratic National Convention, Vietnam War, on and on. When I was doing research for my book, I came across the statistic that in a 18-month period between 1971 and 1972, there was an average of 5 domestic bombings a day in the United States. So we're not at that moment, thankfully, as well. Second thing I'd say under this broad canopy of hope in the context of politics is that the American capacity for self-renewal is one of the wonders of history. This is a country whose moral reflexes aren't dead. They've never died. We've had tough moments. We've had low moments. And we've had periods where our national life has been stained by sin, but we've recovered and we've moved forward. And as Michael was saying, the arc of history often does bend toward justice. And this is an extraordinary nation, and I think that people who give up on it are making a bad bet. And the last thing I'd say is that often virtues create antibodies, and that's true in all sorts of arenas, but including, I would say, in political life as well. And I think that we're seeing some of those antibodies kick in the United States today. People who see things that disturb them and they're not proud. They're exhausted of what's going on, and they want things to be better and higher. And if you talk to people who go around the country, David Brooks is a close friend of mine, and he runs a new program at the Aspen Institute, the Weave Project. And those to go around to communities all across America and sees people in all sorts of different arenas who are reweaving the social fabric, who see a problem, and there are people who are stepping up and healing this country. So we shouldn't give up. There's if you've never listened to it, there's a beautiful speech that Bobby Kennedy gave in South Africa in 1966. It was an extraordinary trip. It was a 5-day trip that Kennedy took, and this was during the height of apartheid. And the reason it was a really important moment was because he was a senator of some influence, but he was also a Kennedy. And so when he went to South Africa, he spoke and he met with various people, and he gave a speech at University of Cape Town, and it's referred to as his Ripples of Hope speech, and actually the words are engraved on his gravestone at Arlington Cemetery. And in it, he's warning against the temptation of despair and cynicism, especially among young people. And in that speech, he says that few will have the greatness to bend history itself, but each of us can work to change a small portion of events, and in the total of all those acts will be written the history of this generation. Each time a man stands up for an ideal, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope, and those ripples build a current which can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance. We're not in South Africa, 1966. We're not in the midst of apartheid. Our task is easier than theirs was, but they succeeded, and so do we. And one of the ways that we can succeed is to be agents of hope, to embody hope, and to make others love hope. And if we do, I think that the Lord will be pleased and be able to say that we were good and faithful servants to the things that He cares about. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. And can I invite the three speakers to please take the stage now? We'll have a discussion and try to get some questions before we close at 8:30. Thank you. Since we're on politics now, let's stay there for a moment. And I want to ask you, Kristen, first of all, one of the reasons, the very obvious reason why this assisted suicide fight is so important. But in addition to it, like the last thing we need is more suicide talk. You know, suicide itself is an epidemic right now in the most horrible ways. And if law is a teacher and we start pushing patients toward this, it's just so dangerous. It's the last thing our culture needs. Obviously, the last thing these vulnerable human lives need. My question for you is, as you're in this mix advocating, do you have hope on this issue? What has your experience been, especially since JJ has died?
Everything you said is so very true. Suicide is epidemic in our country, and we see that in Oregon, general suicide rates are also higher than the national average, and I do have hope on this issue. Like I had shared, JJ's story did help to slow down the legalization of assisted suicide across the country, and proponents often use the very emotional, personal stories to kind of put people on guard and to feel bad about questioning whether we should be doing this. But we're on the side of truth. This is very, very dangerous public policy, and you can't focus on individual emotional stories when you consider this legislation. And I'm always renewed in my hope when I speak with legislators. In the few states that it has been passed in the last few years, like New Jersey and Maine, it passed very narrowly, only by one vote. And so it's a very, very controversial issue still, and legislators, Republicans, Democrats, more often than not, when I speak with them and outline the very real dangers with assisted suicide, they see that, and that gives me hope.
Part of the reason it's so important that you do tell your story the way you tell it is because it's easy for your position to be caricatured as though you haven't experienced pain and continue to experience pain. And so thank you again on behalf of everyone for doing what you're doing. It's so important. On politics, Michael, you do such a good job of staying calm in the midst of this storm. And you do it on social media, and you do it in commentary, and you do it in back rooms. And just practically speaking, how on earth do you do that in this atmosphere? And advice for people who are navigating this, maybe not in the Atlantic and on the national stage, but we all have our stories, as you say.
Well, Pete touched on something really, really critical. As Christians, we can either sort of take our faith and impose on politics or whatever is in our family, whatever is important in our life, sort of ultimate meaning, sort of, well, I'm a Christian, so how I act in politics is sort of my incarnation of the faith itself. And I would argue that is basically idolatry, to sort of transmit the ultimate value of your faith onto something earthly and prudential. And we're seeing quite a lot of that these days on both the left and the right.
I might add, and not just, a lot of attention gets paid to the evangelical part of this,
Sure.
but it's Catholics too.
Sure. And on the healthier way is for your faith to give you a perspective that allows you to look at something like politics, and instead of sort of being willing to sacrifice faithfulness to achieve political ends, actually it's the hope and the humility that you get from your faith that says, I believe this, I think this is best. But there are some things I'm not going to do. For Christians, the ends don't justify the means. The end is the means. The end is faithfulness, and so that's critical. The other thing I'd point out, and Pete touched on this a bit too. Look, either the 23rd Psalm is just something we put up on a plaque and put in our living rooms, or it's the real deal. It's the real article. It's what God can do in our lives if we invite him in that way. This idea, sort of the way that we talk about the 23rd Psalm is, like we read it at funerals, or again, sort of you put it up as like a backdrop in your living room. Listen, David was surrounded on all sides, and that he said, the Lord sets a table before me. I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, but the Lord is with me. If David could find peace in God in those circumstances, then sort of this Flight 93 election stuff doesn't really make much sense for Christians. This sort of idea that, if we don't, if impeachment doesn't happen, or if we don't win the next election, just that's not an option for Christians who are going to be faithful. Now, that doesn't mean, look, I've spent my entire adult life in politics. Politics is very important. But one of the things that Christians could bring in politics, and this is one of the reasons why I appreciate Ben Sass, who is a friend to some of us and someone I disagree with, but I think it's very useful to have at least one senator out of 100 clearly think politics is important. He's dedicated at least this portion of his professional life to it. And yet, as senator, he says politics is not ultimate. That's a important witness and an important thing for the American people to see.
I often think Ben Sass should be America's civics teacher. He really does understand
he tries
it.
sometimes.
He totally tries. Pete, practical advice about how to be hopeful in this madness.
Yeah, I'd say several things, and I want to pick up on something that Michael said, and also your question. Is this on paper here? Okay. Okay, good. Yeah, in terms of how do you be hopeful, I think there are several things that you do. One is you can be involved in politics, and that's in the national level, and the state level, and the local level. I think too often we give short shrift to the local level, where so much of life is lived and plays out, and that includes. There's a couple in our, well, actually one person in particular in the Bible study that my wife Cindy and I host, who is a fearless advocate in school board in Fairfax County, and she should get combat pay for that because she's standing for certain beliefs that are unfashionable within the education world. Some of it is to support and be involved in programs. There are things like Better Angels and Speak Your Peace, which is a wonderful, actually, program that happened in Duluth, where there was a tremendous amount of fracturing that happened. People were dropping out of politics, and people in various areas, sectors of the Duluth community got together and said, look, we're not going to remove the differences that we have, but we've got to be able to engage in politics in a better way. And they actually came up with a list of 9 different qualities that they had to follow under the rubric of civility. And so people can do that. And then there's modeling it in our own lives. Some of it is if you're a person in public life that you model a certain kind of countenance and demeanor. Like Michael does and like others do. But then there's the lives that you lead in the day-to-day. My sense in conversations I have and in some travel is that there's too much pessimism and too much despair and fatalism. It's almost as if people talk like they are seized by forces that we don't control. And you have to remind people that this is a self-governing country. We get to write the chapters, the American chapters. Now, they may be good or they may be bad. It's not preordained what they are. But that really depends so much on us. And one person acting alone, you may think that you're not going to be able to do much. But a lot of people acting together create a movement and a culture. And those things can change the course of a country. I think, for example, like the Me Too movement, which I think is one of the best social movements in the last 50 or 100 years. These women who have been subjected to sexual abuse, they were kept for their lives, for so much of human history, off in the shadows. And all of a sudden, almost like a light switch going from off to on, and these women began to come forward. And all of a sudden, now we see justice being done. It's incredibly painful to hear their stories. But if you know anything about survivors of sexual abuse, that ability to be able to talk about their story, to be in community with other people, to be able to get help, is a hugely healing thing. So these things can change. You don't know when it'll happen often. But that's what I was saying earlier. You have to be faithful. You don't know if you're going to be successful. You have to be faithful, and then you hope you're going to be successful. Just want to say very quickly on what you were picking up on the, how we should engage in public discourse and the attitudes and politics being secondary. One thing I'd say is that, as a general matter, relationships are deeper than politics, and people just have to fight harder than they do not to let relationships fracture over politics. It's very easy to do. People care about politics. They ought to care about politics. People have a lot of deep passions. But people should be much more purposeful, I would say, than they are. at trying to keep those relationships together, especially if they're people of, I must say, of the same faith. If people of faith are breaking down relationally over politics, something's gone wrong. And the second thing is why we have to be in contact and communication with people who had views different than us. One is epistemological modesty, which is actually, I think, a Christian concept, and Paul writes about it, when he says we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. Even if you're right in some objective sense on an issue, there's no way any of us can know fully and completely the truth and reality of things. That's just not going to happen, and we need other people to be able to do that. And there's a story, I write about it in my book, about C.S. Lewis and Owen Barfield. And Lewis, in Surprised by Joy, is about halfway through this spiritual autobiography that he did. He refers to first and second friends. He says, first friend is the person who is your alter ego. That's the person that if you start the sentence, someone else can complete it. For him, it was a person named Arthur Greaves that he knew from his boyhood. And all of us need first friends in life. But then he talked about Owen Barfield, who was a second friend. And Owen Barfield and Lewis had these intense debates, pretty esoteric debates about imagination and reason. But Lewis describes, he says, the second friend is not your alter ego, but your anti-self. It's the person that reads the same books that you do and draws all the wrong conclusions from them. And he said he and Barfield would go at it hammer and tong late into the night, arguing, going back and forth, absorbing the power of each other's punches. Then you begin, almost without knowing it, absorbing what the other person said. And he said out of this dogfight of competition develops an affection. But the punchline here is that Lewis and Barfield both treasured their relationship precisely because they saw the world differently, because they felt like that together it widened the aperture of their understanding and of truth. And Barfield said of Lewis, he said, when Lewis and I debated, we didn't debate for victory, we debated for truth. And that's just an entirely different way of approaching these things. And if we engaged in dialogue and conversation and debate with people who hold views different than us, and we thought, what I want to gain from this is truth, not victory, I think everything would get better.
I think we're going to have time for one question. And I think we have microphones. Okay. Well, as somebody makes their way to the microphone, I have a very quick question for Michael and Peter. Silly little question that a couple of us will appreciate. Why don't you give up on Twitter? Because it can be a madhouse.
Yeah, quickly, I've truly met people that have become friends in real life. And I do think that it's important. It helps me cultivate, make sure that I'm hearing different perspectives. Right. So I found a lot of value in it. I do take regular sabbaticals and break away, and that's also a healthy spiritual discipline too.
Definitely try not to log on Sundays.
Yeah, I'm probably not. I'm fully aware of the downsides of social media and Twitter. I think I'm probably not as hostile as a lot of people are, partly for what Michael said. I actually learn a lot from Twitter, people linking to articles and essays. And then it depends on really who you follow. I mean, there are people who are very smart on Twitter, people who do long threads, which are informed. You just have to be able to monitor yourself and try to be careful not to get pulled down. But if that's the danger, if you feel yourself or if other people in your life that you care about are saying, look, you're being pulled down, there's a gravitational pull into this sort of black hole, then you've just got to either get off of it or stay away. It's like so many things in life. I mean, like science. Science can be used for good purposes or bad purposes, and it's one has to, I guess, fortify oneself to mitigate the bad and hopefully take advantage of the good.
And it's important to be leaven in these places. So thank you both for doing that. Well, it looks like we don't have a question, and it's about time to end anyway. So I want to thank you all for coming once again, and thank you for coming. This was not a quick Uber ride for any of these people. We have upstate New York and 2 DCs, so thank you so much for being here. And also, I'll be here on Friday night with Tim Carney, as David mentioned, so please feel free to come back to be talking about religion in America. Thank you, David.
Yeah, just to piggyback on that, hearing all of you speak about hope in different ways, you mentioned Lewis and Barfield. Think about that other great member of the Inkling, J.R. Tolkien, in his Lord of the Rings, which I see as an epic of hope. And there's a moment where Sam is at his deepest, darkest moment. He looks up and he sees a star. And he says, in that moment, even though the darkness was surrounding them, he realized, and I think that the line is, and then I realized the darkness is a small and passing thing, and above all darkness rides the sun. And I think it's just a beautiful poem to hope. Hope is a distinctly Christian virtue. It didn't make the list of in antiquity, but one virtue that did make the list of antiquity, I think it was Cicero who said that the greatest and parent of all the greatest and parent of all virtues is gratitude. And I just want to express our deepest gratitude to the three of you for being here, for Kathryn for everything you do, and for you being here as well. Now, one little line, if you can just stay in your seat while I escort Peter and Michael upstairs. They will be signing copies of their book, which is for sale at the concession stand. So if you just give us a moment so we can get up there. Thank you again. Safe travels home. Safe travels home.
Thanks a lot.